I went to see a client of mine the other week who's 90 years old, and as you have to do, as I walked into the room, I say, "How are you?" It's an annoyingly generic question. I wish there was a better way of doing that, but I can't think what it is. It's just ask for small talk, doesn't it? But never mind. Happily, sort of, his answer wasn't small talk, and it was a very frank and honest answer. He just said, "Old." At 90 years old, you're like, yeah, okay, you're kind of right. But the sort of sadness in that was that he delivered that answer whilst trying to get out of a chair to shake my hand, and gave up, sat back. I found myself saying in response to this that the privilege of age is the wisdom that should be coming with it, and it's a far better strategy to lean into that wisdom than it is to worry about the body not functioning the way it used to. I don't know where that came from, as I just sort of spontaneously came out with that right there and then, but I love that idea, and almost immediately afterwards I ended up reading Anthony Hopkins' We Did OK Kid, which is very, very good. And that idea stuck with me the whole way through reading this just the wisdom of age being put down there. And I think I would have enjoyed this book anyway, but I enjoyed it all the more for it being that's exactly what Anthony Hopkins is doing, really. I mean, he's telling his life in the memoir, but there's a definite current of wisdom being passed on for other people to pick up in part of that. Whether that's deliberate or not, I don't know. But it's in there. So, yeah, it really sort of transformed how I read that book. Admittedly, I haven't actually seen that many Anthony Hopkins films. It does seem that most of what he does is pretty serious, whereas my taste in movie is a little bit around like a 12-year-old. It's basically, if I'm going to sit down and watch telly for 2 hours, I want it to be fun, and it's not really what Anthony Hopkins does. So my view of him, I guess, has all come from Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs, the elder Zorro in The Mask of Zorro, and the dad in Meet Joe Black. I fully appreciate that two of those are not fun in any way at all. So, yeah, it doesn't always go to plan, but there we go. My impression of him, therefore, is very limited, obviously, and he's playing a part, and he's won 2 Oscars, so, he's obviously a good actor and can portray things other than what he is, so I'm not being silly about that. But the impression I got, you'd think competent, and you'd think warm and kind, I think, from that. I mean, if you rule out Hannibal Lecter, but I assume he's not actually a psychopath. Albeit in the book, he does acknowledge that we all have a bit of Hannibal Lecter in us, and to play it, you've just got to find it and lean into that. Right, that's a bit scary. He does, though, have one of the world's great voices, and I always thought if I was one day to end up sounding like Anthony Hopkins when I grow up, I'd be quite chuffed with that. So basically, that's the only reason I picked this up. And I had it on my shortlist for my birthday gifts for my daughter to pick up and gave me. Well, I don't know if my daughter even knows that she bought it for me, but there we go. It's a good book anyway. The interesting part to this was that he is absolutely nothing like what I expected. And I got a bit of a sense of that in Patrick Stewart's one I read last year, before I was doing book reviews anyway. But I was just struck by the contrast between the sort of faint idea I had in my head of what Anthony Hopkins was and who he really was. And it seems bitter, resentful, not particularly nice, fairly unkind in some of the things he's done, alcoholic at one stage, and a general theme throughout his life of lack of competence. And it's really bizarre. And he's very open about this. But yeah, you pick up a book expecting sort of something, and then you get this completely different person that you're actually reading about. And it's a difficult one to reconcile as you're reading through it. It opens up talking about his childhood, and it's talk about when he's 11 years old, he's sent off to a boarding school he's not happy about, and at this point he seems to resolve to be independent, stoic, not let anybody close to him, and really damaged, I suppose, in many respects. Doesn't sound like he had the particularly nicest upbringing. Doesn't sound disastrous, to be fair. I mean, rating people's upbringings is a terrible idea, obviously. But I mean, it's not. He had both parents, and his dad was very stoic, and there didn't seem much affection going on from his father, at least. But then, to be fair, his response to it was not particularly dramatic. It was just a case of, right, well, if you're not going to be kind and warm to me, I'm just going to keep myself to myself, and that is a theme that carried on throughout his life for quite some way. Albeit it does seem more latterly he has sort of chilled out and become a bit more pleasant. There's a point that's talked about, and it was an April Fool's Day school report that came in, and it was a particularly disappointing one, and a particular pinnacle disappointing moment for his parents, that it wasn't going well. And then he ties this to something sort of clicking in his head that is like, one day I will show you, that sort of mentality. And I suppose in that respect, sort of taking responsibility that he's going to do something, albeit even at that point he had no idea what that direction was going to be, more just a determination to do something better, albeit it wasn't in any of the traditional academic routes. It just clearly wasn't at all for him. It seems pretty early on he met the actor Richard Burton, he'd be 100 odd years old now, so I can't think of anything he's been in, not my time. And it didn't sound like Richard Burton was particularly kind to him, but it seemed to click in Anthony Hopkins' head that, yeah, okay, I'm going to be an actor, because this does seem to be sort of your king of the world sort of thing. And then somewhat surprisingly, maybe, it turns out that he's actually seems like quite a promising actor right from the start. Seems to be a natural sort of talent that needs some honing, but initial signs are good. But it's talked about he's very quickly interrupted by... He caught the tail end of obligatory military service for 2 years. I think it was scrapped in the 50s, whatever it was. So he had to go and do that. And this starts to creep in with the alcohol problem becoming a bit of an issue. And some of the temper issues. Like he gets cornered by someone who's just picking on him when he's minding his own business. You know, this guy deserves a bit of a boot. And he headbutts this guy, which is... I always think psychologically to headbutt someone it's a really... in your face, obviously, literally in your face, but it's kind of like the last resort is you're going to headbutt someone. There's something psychological about someone's willingness to headbutt someone. It's just, oh dear. And that does seem to tie into where he was in life, that sort of thing. But yeah, very self-destructive. Seemed to like the sensibility of just, these are the rules, just follow those, and that seemed to go okay for him. But at the end of 2 years, he's back out and looking for a job again. He gets back into acting anyway. It's almost, I want to say by accident, because obviously there's some credit there that he did a good job. But it almost seems, in a lot of cases, he's getting jobs in spite of the way he's behaving. So perhaps he just always was a particularly genius actor. But it's also flagged early on that he's really raw and needs some training. So he does have to go off to RADA at one point to go and get that all sorted and get back on track. He does also talk about alcohol really does start to play a big role in his life here, and it helps him to keep himself to himself, as he puts it. Tied with that, there's always either something to celebrate or something to commiserate, so there's basically always a drinking excuse. He also talks about how he basically missed the 60s, despite being it seems like a semi-successful actor during the 60s. He was so socially withdrawn and liked to drink alone that he basically missed it all. He ends up getting married anyway, which sounds like it was an utter disaster from the start. But by the point you realise that you've got to get out, it's too late. His wife is pregnant. I say too late. He ends up leaving shortly after anyway, after the baby is born, basically because they seem to rub each other up the wrong way to such a degree that he was worried that he would hurt her himself or whatever else. So takes off. But he takes off in the sense that that's it. It seems to be no contact with his daughter or anything. So... it's a difficult one. And he handles it well in terms of he's very open and honest, well, seemingly honest, very open about what his part in that is. It does sound like his wife was tricky, but, you know, when you're alcoholic, you can't really blame the other person entirely, can you? And how he went about it in terms of just completely cutting off, it just seems a little extreme. But, yeah, I mean, to be fair, he's mindful of that and puts his hands up to it. It sounds like at points along this he did consider just ending it all. He doesn't dwell on that, and it doesn't sound like he actually made any attempts, but it does seem to play into his mind that was a possibility. And I guess that would tie with the whole self-destructive thing. And he's talking about someone, a Russian chap, introducing him to tequila in some movie they were doing, and find that tequila made him even worse than whiskey and beer. And it's, when you think it's as bad as it can get, it seems like it can actually get worse. At age 37, mercifully you'd have to say, he has a health scare. I think it was thrombosis or something. But the doctor sounds like he went above and beyond in terms of just reading him the riot act. You know, basically, you need to sort this out or you're going to die. And it didn't seem like anything that particularly did anything at that stage, or certainly put it in his mind. But then apparently shortly after he had a blackout at a party that he doesn't remember anything of what he did. And he drove a car across Arizona with no memory of having done it. And even to the point the next day reporting his car stolen to his producer or agent, whatever it was. So no, That wasn't stolen, that was you, and we found you, and if we hadn't found you, you'd be in prison now. And it seems that's the catalyst, the worry that he could have killed someone, and how disappointed his parents might be that he'd just been that bad, that he finally acknowledges he's got a problem with alcohol and goes to check into Alcoholics Anonymous. Interestingly, this was 50 years ago or something, and apparently he still goes to meetings. It's a really interesting take on alcoholism. And I suppose that I don't know anything about it, but I assume that's the norm. I guess it's the fact that you're never not an alcoholic, you're just sober. He does also say that you can't fight alcoholism because it will beat you, and the trick is to accept it and go with it, as it were, which is a very sort of Aikido principle, which is brilliant. I love Aikido, the martial arts, not the shop. The principle there is you don't oppose force with force, you get out of the way and then redirect the force. And I suppose that seems to work a lot of places really well in life, I find. And it seems in alcoholism that seems to work there as well. He also seems to find God in this process, but it's not quite clear to what extent. He seems to talk quite openly about God, but doesn't talk about it in any sort of Christian sense or any other religious sense. But I think I've heard somewhere else that a lot of people through Alcoholics Anonymous can sort out their addiction by replacing it almost with God. Not to say the addiction is ever fixed, but it's that whole idea that you latch onto something else to replace the thing that you were doing. And obviously religious faith has a sort of a strong element in it of being a sort of all-consuming and very healthy for taking over the place of something harmful and destructive. One of the ideas that I couldn't shake whilst reading this, I am very deliberate about I don't drink on a school night after a hard day at work, just because I fear habits that can spiral into things. And you do wonder, I mean, is that a psychological predisposition to alcoholism, or could anyone end up hooked on alcohol just through the compounding effect of habits? But also this whole idea of the way he dealt with adversity. And when he was a kid, fair enough, but as he got older, it was still keep yourself to yourself, screw the world. And it was a really sort of hostile thing. And the perception clearly is that was strength. And I think it would seem obvious that that's the opposite of strength. Strength is being able to deal with things, whereas the whole stoicism thing. I mean, the way he describes the stoicism, it's not quite stoic. I think it is a bit more bitter and resentful. I think stoicism, as it's supposed to be, is meant to be a little bit more peaceful than it comes across here. But if you're having to turn away from things and bury feelings and hide stuff, that's not healthy and strong, is it? That's just, I can't cope with that, so I'm going to go and over here. So there's a sort of miscalculation throughout most of his life where he thought he was being strong, and following what happened with his father and his grandfather, they were both the same. And it's sort of tragic, isn't it? That people spend their entire lives thinking they're achieving something when actually all they're doing is hurting themselves. It is, though, super impressive taking of responsibility. I mean, he's in his late 80s now, so you'd hope that you'd sort of grown and developed. And that's what I love most about this, that whole idea that we should be getting better throughout our lives. And Anthony Hopkins has clearly done that. He's clearly a much better person now than he was. But that's often not the case, is it? You do meet a lot of people who are just, I don't want to be mean about old people, but a lot of old people who are pretty useless. And they've just let their foibles compound throughout their lives, so they basically just get worse and worse. And perhaps that's something that's useful in being an actor, and that I'm not sure if I suppose he's still working to the extent that he's written his book, but I think he was doing plays and stuff until fairly recently. I'm not sure if there's any plans to keep doing it, but that's great, isn't it? In your mid-80s you can still go and do stuff, whereas for the rest of us, I doubt my job will want me on there for much after my 70th birthday. And then what do? You don't have all that stuff to be doing. You've got to find something else to replace it with. I do think the general trend is that people do seem to shrivel up and become smaller people. And yes, physically that's always going to be true, obviously, as we age. But I just love that he's leaning into that and putting that out into the world for everybody to learn from the mistakes he made. And he's still doing stuff. So you can see he seems to be progressing with age and getting better, which is not something that many people can say, I don't think. He also acknowledges he may have Asperger's or something like that. I don't know if that's reasonable, but he sort of dismisses it and says he always thought of himself just as a cold fish. And I quite like that, especially at the minute, people dying for labels and things to hang responsibility on around the neck of that. And it's like, well, I've got this or I've got that, and therefore I don't have to try very hard, or it's not my fault. He's acknowledging, yeah, maybe that's a thing, but ultimately I got to take responsibility for all this stuff. And actually, I just think of myself as I'm just not very nice, just a little bit mean. He does seem much nicer now, anyway. And last but not least, he acknowledges that he's not smart enough to have deliberately carried out his career the way he did. And that's interesting because this is a theme throughout the book, that he's not that smart. It's hard to look at him on the screen and go, really, he's not very smart? And you can't help but think that actually maybe it is more something like Asperger's or whatever, and actually that's just been a massive social thing that's held him back, and it's manifested as being, he's not very academic, because he's not really interested in being academic. So, yeah, in that respect, you can sort of see where the labels might make some sense, because it might have told him earlier on, don't try and be academic, you can do something else. That's certainly the positive side. But yeah, a difficult one to try and balance, I suppose, but it's definitely a tricky area to go through. I don't actually have any quotes from this one, which is not deliberate. I just happened not to write any down as I went through, and I got to the end of something and realised, oh, no, I haven't. But never mind. There's no point doing it arbitrarily. The last section of the book is a bunch of poems. He just records a bunch of poems that he really likes. So if you're into poetry, then great. Unfortunately, that's not my cup of tea at all. As much as it's potentially an idea that you think, oh, it'd be nice if I was into poetry, because that would make me a rounder person, but I'm just not. So there we go. But yeah, it's a great book. I have to say, I enjoyed most of the books I read, but this one, it was the first time in a while I've been eager to go and pick it back up to see what happens next. So yeah, well worth the read.